I'm missing one critical input. You didn't paste part 1, it shows previous part, but nothing after. Without it, I can't guarantee part 2 won't accidentally repeat events or contradict the setups he's foreshadowing you already used. Send part 1, even rough, and I'll write part 2 to match it seamlessly. Meanwhile, here is part 2, English voiceover ready, Act 2 escalation, rivalry, plus ticking clock plus twists. After you share part 1, I can tighten continuity and ensure zero repetition. In Winnipeg, the air always feels sharper when history is about to change, like the city itself is holding its breath. John Bracken has just stepped out of the university world, where problems come with footnotes and solutions arrive in semesters. But politics doesn't grade on curves. It grades in shortages, in anger, in headlines that can ruin you before breakfast. The farmers are restless. Wheat prices swing like a door in a prairie wind. Credit is tight. Rail rates pinch. And in the middle of it all, Manitoba's government is wobbling. Old parties, old habits, old promises that sound like they were printed on paper so thin you can see through it. Bracken doesn't enter this world with a roar. He enters like a man walking into a barn fire carrying buckets. Quiet, stubborn, convinced that if you just keep moving, you can save something. But here's the first shock. The prairie doesn't reward something. It rewards everything or nothing. The United Farmers are rising, not as a party in the traditional sense, but as a movement that feels more like a verdict. They're tired of being treated like a resource to be harvested. Taxes in one direction, promises in the other. They want someone who understands them without performing for them. And Bracken, an agronomist and administrator, a man whose power comes from credibility, seems almost designed for this moment. Then comes the twist that changes his life. They don't just want his advice. They want his name. The offer lands with the weight of a storm cloud. Lead us. Not as a slick politician, not as a backroom operator. As a figure who can make the movement look like government, not rebellion. Bracken hesitates because he understands the trap. If you lead a movement, you inherit its purity and its rage. You become the target for every disappointed hope. And already, somewhere across Manitoba's political map, there are men who smell blood. Experienced party bosses who think the farmers can be outmaneuvered. Editors ready to paint Bracken as a naive professor who wandered into the mud. Competitors who believe that if you simply wait long enough, the prairie will swallow him. But Bracken is not naive, he's methodical. He takes the offer the way a surgeon takes a risky case, knowing that the patient might die and the blame might be his. And so the second act begins with a paradox. A man with no taste for theatrical politics walks onto the stage at the moment when the audience is angriest. The Manitoba election doesn't just feel like a contest. It feels like a revolt wearing a suit. When the results hit, it's the kind of night that turns ordinary rooms into history books. The United Farmers, rebranded into a new political force, win. Not a few seats, enough to govern. And suddenly Bracken is no longer simply John Bracken. He is Premier Bracken. A man who came from fields and classrooms now holds the levers of a province. The cameras don't see the cost yet, but it's there, already. Because Manitoba is not a clean slate, it's a ledger. And the numbers don't care about ideals. Bracken inherits a government at a time when the world economy is tightening like a fist. People want relief, they want action, they want miracles, and they want them delivered on time. But Bracken's opponents, his competitors, are sharpening a different weapon: impatience. They whisper that he's too careful, too academic, too slow, that he can't play the game the way a real political predator can. And then, as if history decides to test him personally, the Great Depression arrives like a winter that doesn't end. The fields still stretch to the horizon, but the money doesn't. Unemployment rises. Families count pennies like prayers. The pressure isn't just economic, it's emotional. It's the feeling that the floor is giving way and no one has a rope. In that kind of atmosphere, compromise stops looking like wisdom and starts looking like betrayal. And Bracken, who believes in steady governance, faces a brutal truth. Steadiness can look like weakness when people are desperate. He tries to hold the center. He tries to keep Manitoba solvent. But every decision has an enemy. Cut spending? You're heartless. Spend more? You're reckless. Raise taxes? You're stealing from the poor. Don't raise them. You're destroying the future. And the rival waiting in the wings, whether from the old parties or from within the movement itself, has a simple strategy: blame the man at the top. Turn complexity into a villain. The second twist is quieter but more dangerous. The movement that brought him to power begins to transform. Because once you win, you stop being the people and start being the government. And the government is always guilty in the public imagination. Bracken is forced to evolve. The United Farmers can't remain a pure protest vehicle if it wants to survive. It must become a broader coalition. So Bracken helps reshape it into a new political identity that can hold urban and rural, labor and business, pragmatists and idealists in one uneasy structure. This is where the rivalry becomes personal. Competitors call it betrayal. They say he's watering down the cause. They say he's building a machine. Bracken argues he's building a bridge. But bridges are hardest to build when everyone is throwing rocks. Now add the ticking clock. Bracken is not just fighting elections, he's fighting collapse. He knows, because he reads the numbers like a doctor reads a pulse, that if Manitoba loses financial credibility, the province can spiral into a deeper crisis. Borrowing dries up, services crumble, and chaos invites extremists. He has a window, thin as a sheet of ice, to keep the province functioning. And every month that ice cracks. In cabinet rooms, voices rise. In newspapers, rivals mock. In towns, people demand answers that no one on earth can provide. In Ottawa, federal policies and national pressures collide with provincial realities. Bracken has to be both a shield and a compass, and both roles bruise you. His greatest strength, discipline, starts to become his most visible vulnerability. He refuses to perform panic. He refuses to throw gasoline on fear just to look decisive. But sometimes the public doesn't want calm. It wants a show. And that is exactly what his competitors offer. They offer slogans. They offer scapegoats. They offer the intoxicating certainty that there is one simple enemy: banks, outsiders, the other party, the other region, and one simple cure. Bracken stands against that. He insists on the brutal honesty of limits. That honesty keeps the province upright, but it also keeps him surrounded by people who resent the messenger. As the 1930s grind forward, Manitoba becomes a test of endurance. The province is a pressure cooker, drought in the wider prairie world, political radicalization elsewhere, and an electorate that learns to measure leaders not by intention but by survival. And Bracken survives. That alone is a kind of achievement. He keeps winning, not because people adore him, but because enough people trust him more than they trust the alternatives. They may not cheer, but they don't want to gamble with the province's spine. Yet the rivalry doesn't fade, it adapts. Opponents aim not just at policies, but at his identity. He's not one of us. He's too elite. He's a professor playing premier. He hides behind committees. And Bracken, by instinct, does what his rivals least expect. He doesn't chase applause. He chases structure. He professionalizes. He consolidates. He builds a political form that can hold under strain. It's not romantic, it's not cinematic, but it's how you keep a province alive when the economy is trying to kill it. Then the world shifts again. War clouds gather overseas, and even before Canada formally enters the Second World War, you can feel the change. Factories reorient. A federal power expands. National unity becomes both a demand and a weapon. For a provincial premier, wartime is a dangerous kind of spotlight. Ottawa's shadow grows. The room for independent maneuvers shrinks. Every decision has a patriotic lens applied to it. Bracken's competitors see opportunity. If they can paint him as out of step with the national mood, they can finally unseat him. And now Bracken faces a different kind of clock. Not just Manitoba's finances, Canada's future. The war will reorganize everything. Labor markets, production, government authority, public expectations. If Manitoba doesn't position itself, it will be dragged. And dragged provinces break. Bracken tries to align Manitoba's needs with national realities, but he won't surrender provincial dignity. It's a balancing act that requires constant negotiation with Ottawa, with municipalities, with industries, with voters who are tired of sacrifice. And then comes a call that changes the entire trajectory. Another twist, bigger than the first. Ottawa wants him, not as a footnote, as a leader. The federal Conservative Party, damaged, searching, desperate for a face that can compete, looks at Bracken and sees something rare. A man who has proven he can govern through catastrophe. But to accept means stepping into an arena where rivals don't just want to beat you, they want to erase you. The offer is a doorway with fire on both sides. If he stays in Manitoba, his enemies continue to grind at him, but he remains in familiar terrain. If he goes federal, he becomes a symbol in a national war of narratives. And there's an unspoken pressure that makes it even sharper. Canada is at war. Every political move is judged against that backdrop. Leaders are expected to be bigger than themselves. Bracken weighs it like a farmer weighing seed. What will grow, what will die, what is risk, what is cowardice? He chooses the leap. He resigns as premier, ending a remarkable provincial run that started as an improbable experiment and became a model of prairie pragmatism. But he doesn't leave as a man escaping. He leaves as a man walking into a storm because he believes the storm needs a steady hand. His rivals in Manitoba don't mourn. Some celebrate. They think the professor is finally out of the game. But Bracken's true competitor now is larger than any local opponent. It's a national political machine, a federal stage where the spotlight doesn't warm you, it burns you. And as he boards this new path, there's one more cruel detail about the clock. War doesn't wait for anyone to learn their lines. He has to become a national leader fast. Because in Ottawa, hesitation is not a personality trait. It's a death sentence. If you paste Part 1, I will remove any overlap with Part 1's events phrasing, adjust the opening sentence to grab exactly where Part 1 ends, and recheck exact character count to keep it within 10,000, 11,000 characters. Imagine this. You spend 2 decades holding a province together with your bare hands, and the moment you finally have the machinery running smoothly, you're told you now have only a few short years to help save an entire country, leading a party that doesn't even fully want you there. The train that carries John Bracken east feels smaller than the prairie sky he's leaving behind. In Manitoba, he knew every pressure point: grain prices, rail rates, river levels, municipal councils. In Ottawa, the air is thicker, cigar smoke, polished floors, whispers in corridors that are older than the province he governed. The war is still raging. Men are dying overseas. At home, the government of William Lyon Mackenzie King has wrapped itself in the flag and the aura of stability. And the federal Conservatives, the party that is called Bracken here, sit bruised, suspicious, half convinced they're inviting in a stranger to rearrange their own house. He steps onto the platform knowing one brutal truth. He doesn't just have to beat his rivals across the aisle, he has to beat his rivals behind his back. And the clock on both fronts is already ticking. From the first meetings, you can hear the collision of worlds. Old Conservative organizers, steeped in decades of partisan war, test his every word. They've lost elections. They've lost prestige. They cling to habits like lifeboats. Then comes this quiet man from the prairies, with his flat voice and his farmer's patience, saying things that sound almost heretical. In Tory circles, the party must change its name. It must adopt a broader, more social program. It must speak not only to business and traditional elites, but to workers, farmers, and the new urban middle class that emerged from the Depression and war. His key rival, Mackenzie King, already speaks to them, sometimes with maddening vagueness, but with an instinct for reassurance. If Bracken simply offers an older version of the same promise, he'll lose before the first poster goes up. So he throws a grenade into the Conservative identity itself. He makes it a condition. If they want him, they must accept a new banner: Progressive Conservative. To many in the party's old guard, the phrase sounds like a contradiction in terms, an insult to their lineage. Progressivism is what swept him into power in Manitoba, what they once dismissed as agrarian protest. Now this prairie premier wants to weld that energy to the party of MacDonald and Borden and call it one thing. Behind closed doors, voices rise. Some mutter that they should pick a leader from their own ranks. Others warn that without change, they will simply watch the Liberals rule Canada for another generation. Tension tightens like a rope. In that rope, Bracken sees opportunity. He's spent his life braiding opposites, farm and city, austerity and welfare, prudence and innovation, into something that holds. This is just the largest rope yet. They accept. Reluctantly, nervously, but they accept. Overnight, Canada's political map acquires a new label. The party's stationery, its signage, its very name now carries Bracken's fingerprint. Rival Conservatives who hope to control him from behind the curtain suddenly realize the curtain itself has been replaced. They don't forget this. Some bide their time, smiling through their teeth. Others adapt, sensing that if Bracken fails, they all fail together. Meanwhile, across the aisle, Mackenzie King watches with that sphinx-like expression of his. The Progressive Conservatives are trying to steal the word progress itself. It's a daring move, but can they make the word mean anything concrete? That question drags Bracken into the grind of his federal work. Gone are the days when he could walk out of his office and smell the weather, talk to a farmer at the edge of a field, judged the season by the feel of the soil. Now his life is stacks of briefs, marathon policy sessions, long nights in hotel rooms with maps spread across beds, ridings, demographics, industrial clusters, rail lines, troop deployment. He pushes his team to build something the Conservatives haven't really had in years, a coherent program for post-war Canada that speaks to ordinary lives. Unemployment insurance, social security expansion, assistance for veterans returning from the front, development for underserved regions, modern infrastructure that links the country more fairly. He knows that if the Liberals own the language of social protection, the Progressive Conservatives have to own the language of responsible, practical reform. It's Manitoba's budget discipline scaled up to a nation, but wrapped for the first time in a promise of wider opportunity. Not everyone in his camp likes what he's writing. Some of his colleagues sneer at what they call prairie sentimentalism. They want sharp cuts, not social policy. They want to attack King, not compete with him on housing, jobs, education. To them, Bracken sounds almost like a liberal who misplaced his membership card. They remind him that business leaders write checks, and business leaders are wary of new commitments. He answers with ledgers and memories. The province he left behind kept its books honest while building roads, schools, and services, because they were investments in survival. A country that sends hundreds of thousands of men to war, he insists, will either reward their sacrifice with a better life or face the fury of betrayal. He talks about the Dust Bowl years, about how hopelessness breeds extremism, how fragile societies become when they forget the people. At the bottom of the balance sheet, some in the room shift uncomfortably. Others, especially younger candidates, lean in. They can feel the post-war world approaching like a front of weather you can't dodge. All the while, the rivalry with King hardens into a personal duel, even if the two men rarely clash face to face. King is cautious, mystical, intensely private, governing through diaries and carefully calibrated speeches. Bracken is practical, empirical, trained to read crop tests and economic graphs rather than dreams. King rules from the center of a vast web of patronage and loyalty. Bracken is still an outsider, assembling a national team faster than any agronomist ever had to seed a field. In Parliament, Liberal ministers defend wartime controls, rationing, and conscription compromises. In the country, they present themselves as guardians of national unity. Bracken has to attack without looking unpatriotic. He must criticize the government of a nation at war without giving a single voter the impression that he underestimates the sacrifice at the front. Every word is a tightrope, every misstep is ammunition. And here comes a twist that would crush a weaker politician. For a time, the national leader of the Progressive Conservatives doesn't even have a seat in the House of Commons. He leads his party from outside the chamber, hearing the roar of debates he cannot join, reading transcripts of speeches he cannot counter in real time. His rivals mock the situation. How can a man claim he's ready to govern Canada, they say, when he doesn't even represent a single riding? The insult stings, but it also frees him. While ministers are chained to their benches in Ottawa, Bracken travels. He rides trains from coast to coast, shaking hands in stations, peering out at shipyards and factories and small-town main streets, lit by war contracts and overtime shifts. He visits farm kitchens where sons' photos hang in uniform on the wall. He hears with painful clarity the question that sits behind every polite conversation. After this, after the dust and blood and telegrams, what kind of country will we have? The ticking clock tightens to a deadline, the post-war election. No one knows exactly when it will hit, but everyone knows it's coming and that it will be brutal. Voters will be exhausted. They will have endured rationing, casualties, inflation. They won't have patience for abstract visions. They will want proof. Bracken pushes his campaign team hard. They craft speeches that hammer home the idea of security with responsibility, jobs for veterans, support for families, regional development, but also fiscal realism. He refuses to promise the moon. He's seen what overpromising does when revenues collapse. Yet he also refuses to retreat into the old conservative comfort zone of austerity and nostalgia. Night after night, he refines his message, testing phrases, cutting anything that sounds like an easy slogan. He knows what he's facing. King's image as a cautious steward. The Liberals claim that to change governments now is to risk everything soldiers have fought for. The rivalry becomes a contest between two very different visions of safety. The campaign trail in 1945 feels like a country shifting gears in real time. The war in Europe draws to a close. People crowd into halls and onto street corners, not just to cheer, but to judge. In one town, Bracken speaks in a hall that still smells of engine oil from the factory workers who used it as a lunchroom. In another, he stands on a makeshift platform outside a grain elevator, the wooden ribs behind him black against the sky. His voice is not fiery, but it is steady. And for some audiences, that steadiness is exactly the point. He talks about planning, about not leaving the post-war world to chance. His internal rivals worry he's too sober, too flat. They want him to attack King personally, to shout about liberal corruption and war profiteers. Bracken refuses. He knows King's greatest weakness isn't scandal, it's fatigue. If voters are going to turn, it will be because they are ready to try a different kind of competence, not because they've been whipped into a rage. Election day arrives like a storm front, sudden, final, indifferent to preparation. Ballot boxes close from St. John's to Vancouver. In smoky backrooms, progressive conservative organizers trace numbers on chalkboards, watching ridings they've targeted flicker between red and their new shade of blue. Early returns suggest something startling. The party is not being crushed. In fact, it's fighting. Seats flip. New faces, veterans, businessmen, Western candidates, win places in Ottawa under the progressive conservative banner. The party is no longer a relic. It is a contender. And then, in the middle of the maps and cheers, a brutal figure lands on the table like a fist. In his own riding, John Bracken is behind. Liberal scrutineers in Winnipeg smile very quietly. When the final count is done, the result is a paradox sharp enough to cut skin. Nationwide, Bracken has pulled his party back from the brink, but he himself has lost his seat. There's a kind of silence that doesn't need microphones. In the room where he hears the news, you can almost feel the air thicken. His rivals, external and internal, will seize on this. Mackenzie King, though shaken by the loss of seats and the clear message that his majority is slimmer, still stands as Prime Minister. The Liberals have survived. The progressive Conservatives have risen from the canvas, but the man who led the rise has been knocked to the floor of his own constituency. For an ordinary politician, this might be the exit cue. But Bracken has never measured his life by theatrical moments. He measures it by structures. He looks at the map, at the strengthened caucus, at the upgraded machinery of the party, and understands. The project he began is not finished, and the country's post-war direction is not yet settled. So he does something almost unheard of in modern politics. He remains leader without a seat. Those years are some of the strangest and hardest of his career. Canada is shifting from war footing to peacetime economy. Veterans return, some broken in body, some in mind. Housing shortages bite. Inflation gnaws at paychecks. The Cold War's first chill winds blow across headlines. In Ottawa, Mackenzie King prepares to hand off power within his own party, shaping the Liberal succession like an old maestro arranging the final notes of a long symphony. Outside the House, Bracken works to keep his progressive Conservatives coherent. He pushes them to speak to new industries, to Quebec, to the growing suburbs around cities that barely existed when he first entered politics. He organizes policy conferences, encourages research, tries to keep the progressive half of the party name from becoming a decorative word. It is slow, frustrating work. Some in caucus grumble openly now. The memory of collapse has faded. The appetite for victory has sharpened. They want a leader who can win not just seats, but the big prize, government. New rivals emerge from within his own camp. George Drew, the ambitious and charismatic Premier of Ontario, watches the federal scene with clear interest. John Diefenbaker, a sharp-tongued Prairie MP, builds his reputation as an orator of the backbenches. Both embody different paths for the progressive Conservatives. One polished, urbane, steeped in Ontario's business-friendly pragmatism, the other fiery populist, appealing to the restless West that once lifted Bracken himself. They respect him, but they also see the opening that time always carves. Quiet conversations begin. Maybe the party needs a leader in the House, a seat-holding figure who can confront the Liberals face-to-face. Donors, too, wonder whether Bracken's careful, undramatic style can truly dislodge a government that has woven itself into the national fabric over so many years. Under that pressure, the hours in his office stretch long. He reads reports about industrial development in Ontario, farm policies in the West, federal-provincial tensions over taxation. He knows, more intimately than almost anyone else, how hard it is to keep different regions aligned, how fragile the balance between central authority and local autonomy. He offers constructive criticism, calls for clearer constitutional arrangements, better revenue sharing, more deliberate planning. Many of his ideas will outlast him. But politics rarely rewards architects while they're still sketching. Cameras prefer demolition and ribbon cutting to blueprints. While he thinks in spans of decades, some of his colleagues think in news cycles and leadership contests. The clock that once was set by war and elections now ticks in a different way. Age, energy, the patience of colleagues. Bracken feels it. The journeys that once invigorated him now leave him exhausted. The fights that once felt like necessary storms now sometimes feel like loops. Factions returning to the same arguments about ideology and tactics over and over. He looks at younger men around the table and sees in them versions of what he once was. Hungry, convinced that if only they had the wheel in their hands, the road ahead would straighten. The rivalry that began with Mackenzie King has metastasized into a more intimate struggle between his own sense of duty and his growing awareness that he may be holding back the very party he tried to save. One evening, long after most of Ottawa has gone home, he stands by a window in a quiet office. The city lights reflected in the glass like distant stars. Snow drifts along the street outside, muffling the sound of late traffic. On his desk lies a draft letter, its sentences weighed and reweighed. Words about service, about transition, about the need for renewal. He thinks of Manitoba's fields under winter crust, seemingly lifeless, waiting for the moment when, by stepping back and letting the season turn, you allow new growth to come through. His whole career has been about managing change without drama. Now the change is himself. Somewhere not far away, his competitors inside the party tally their chances, plan their moves. Across the river, the government he has spent years trying to unseat carries on its business as though leaders were interchangeable parts. He knows better. He knows that when a man leaves power, whether provincial or federal, the real story is not just what he did, but what survives in the institutions and habits he leaves behind. That story hasn't been written yet. But the decision that will set its tone is now in his hands. He signs the letter. Not with a flourish, not with a shaking hand, but with the same economical motion he once used to jot field notes about seed varieties and rainfall. That's the shock in it. No drama, no cameras, just ink on paper, and yet this quiet gesture detonates at the center of his life. For more than a quarter of a century, John Bracken has been premier, then leader, the man others introduce with titles and expectations. Now, with a few careful sentences to the party president, he sets a clock ticking toward his own disappearance from the stage. Behind the letter, though, is a decision as ruthless as anything in politics. He will step aside before they push him. There is a leadership convention coming, donors whispering, potential successors circling. Rivalry, the invisible current of his career, is suddenly unmasked and close, no longer across the aisle but at his elbow. George Drew's name is everywhere. Diefenbaker's fierce oratory cuts through caucus meetings. Reporters drop hints about new blood, fresh faces, a leader who actually sits in the House. Bracken can hear it all without anyone needing to say it to his face. He sets a deadline in his own mind, a line he will not cross. He will not be humiliated in public ballot after ballot. His years of work reduced to tally sheets and whispered trades in smoke-filled hotel corridors. If the party he rebuilt wants a different pilot, he will hand over the controls while the plane is still in the air, but on his terms. That's the time limit he gives himself. Step out before the convention stopwatch starts, or let other men define the story of your exit forever. Once the letter is delivered, the political machinery moves with startling speed. Announcements, speculation, editorials suddenly written in a past tense that hasn't quite arrived. Bracken's tenure, Bracken's experiment, Bracken's long, careful stewardship. There's a chill in seeing your political life treated like an autopsy while your heart still beats. Old rivals in the Liberal camp manage polite statements about his integrity. Mackenzie King, edging toward his own departure, notes his constructive contributions. It's the language politicians reserve for people they've spent years trying to bury. Inside the progressive conservative camp, the reaction splits. Some are genuinely grateful. They know how far the party had sunk before he agreed, almost against his instincts, to lead it. They remember the horror of the 1940 result and the slow, disciplined rebuild. Others are already looking past him. For them, he becomes, overnight, a bridge that has already done its job. Crossed, useful, now irrelevant. Their eyes glitter with the prospect of the convention fight ahead. Grain prices, regional policy, social legislation, these were the tools of his politics. For them, the new tools are microphones, charisma, image. The leadership convention that crowns his successor plays out like a play he chose not to audition for. Delegates chant other men's names. Ballots rise and fall. The cameras that never much cared for his measured voice now swarm around George Drew, capturing the smile, the handshake, the image of renewal. Somewhere on the margins, Bracken is present but not central. He watches with a detached calm that surprises even him. This, he knows, is what he prepared the party for. To be competitive again, to be something more than a historical footnote. But the twist lands with a quiet thud. He has given them the instrument, and they have chosen someone else to play it. Here, another rivalry takes shape, not between men in office, but between versions of history. In the years to come, some will say Drew rebuilt the party. Others will hail John Diefenbaker's eventual wave of support as the turning point. In that story, Bracken risks becoming a parenthetical phrase, a footbridge between the old Tory machine and the new progressive conservatism. He senses this even as he slips out of the limelight. The fear that stalks him now is not losing an election. He's done that. It's losing the thread of what he tried to weave into the country's fabric. When he leaves Ottawa, it's not in disgrace or fanfare. It's almost mundane. A man in his mid-60s stepping onto a train again, but this time there are no reporters at the windows counting his suitcases, no party officials pacing the platform. He carries a lifetime of documents, books, and small personal artifacts that wouldn't fill even a fraction of the archives kept for more flamboyant leaders. No portraits have been commissioned. No monuments await unveiling. The contrast with the power he once held is almost brutal. 21 years at the helm of Manitoba, then the leadership of a national party, and the exit is as quiet as a librarian closing a file. He returns to what he has always trusted most, the land, the classroom, and the quiet work of institutions. Advisory roles appear, boards, commissions, agricultural bodies that value his knowledge more than his name on a ballot. For a man who began in experimental plots, returning to the technical, the practical, feels like stepping back into a comfortable pair of boots. He speaks at conferences, consults on economic and agricultural questions, offers counsel that few recognize as the wisdom of a former premier and national leader. Often he is introduced simply as Mr. Bracken, former professor, former premier. The grander titles fade from the introductions sooner than you might think, but the rivalry that once drove him outward now turns inward. All his life he has measured himself against others, university colleagues, political opponents, the formidable Mackenzie King, the skeptical business community, the impatient party activists. Now, in the quieter rooms of post-political life, his opponent is the most implacable one yet. Time. How much of what he built will endure? How long before the party he renamed drops the progressive or hollows it out until it's just paint on a sign? How long before Manitoba's balanced budgets and cautious innovations are recast as footnotes to someone else's narrative? Visitors who come to see him in these years often leave struck by the absence of bitterness. He talks about crops, about water management, about the need for governments to think in long arcs instead of electoral cycles. He rarely complains about colleagues who turned on him or about voters who sent him home. His criticism, when it appears, can be devastating but remains specific. This policy ignores the West. That program misjudges the needs of small towns. This government is forgetting that prosperity is fragile. He still thinks like a premier whose job is to hold a whole contradictory territory together. Only now the territory is his memory of Canada, and he's no longer in charge. And yet there are moments when the mask slips. A newspaper arrives with a profile of George Drew, glowing over his leadership style, his tenant farmer roots, his hard-edged fight with the Liberals. The article calls Drew the man who has made the Conservative Party competitive again. Bracken folds the paper carefully, sets it aside, and says nothing. But the next time the subject comes up, he tells a visitor, almost offhand, "Parties don't turn in a single season. You plant for years." It sounds simple, but underneath it is a judgment. The seeds were sown before the photographers showed up. History adds a twist none of them can control. Drew falters at the federal level. The party stumbles. It is not under his watch that the Progressive Conservatives finally seize Ottawa. That moment belongs to John Diefenbaker, the Prairie Fire brand, in 1957. When that landslide comes, reporters rediscover Bracken's name for a moment. They suddenly remember that the party Diefenbaker leads is not just conservative, but progressive conservative, that the outreach to farmers, workers, and the western provinces has a lineage. They write tidy background pieces that trace the chronology. The agrarian professor in Manitoba, the coalition premier, the federal leader who insisted on changing the party's name as a condition of his acceptance. There is something almost cruel in it. The victory he worked toward, ending the liberal dominance that King built, offering a more inclusive and disciplined alternative, arrives. When he is far from the front lines, he watches the coverage on a modest set, the cheering crowds, the waving flags, the bombastic speeches about a new national policy. The party logo on the podium carries the word he forced on it years before: progressive. The country, seeing it anew, assumes it has always been that way. Legacy, he understands now, is often an inheritance. People don't bother to trace back to the original donor. In these years, when his name appears, it is usually in lists. Manitoba premiers, leaders of the Progressive Conservative Party, figures in Canada's political realignment. Lists have no room for the long nights, the detailed budgets, the quiet conversations that kept provinces solvent and parties from imploding. They flatten rivalry into a sequence. This man versus that man, this election versus that one. They cannot capture the way he spent himself trying to reconcile farmer and city dweller, the frugal and the ambitious, the cautious and the restless. But in another register, among civil servants, academics, and old political hands, a different memory survives. Bracken as the man who made non-partisanship respectable, who proved that you could fuse progressive social policy with fiscal discipline without tearing a government in two. He ages steadily without the public dramas that haunt some ex-leaders. No scandals emerge, no desperate attempts at a comeback. He doesn't write a grandiose memoir decorated with score-settling and revelations. That perhaps is his most startling choice in a century that increasingly rewards spectacle. He lets his record stand without a shout. For historians, this restraint is both a gift and a frustration. They must reconstruct his motives from letters, minutes, policy drafts, and the testimonies of others. He leaves few diary entries, no mystical seances, no theatrical confessions. In a political culture that loves flamboyant personalities, his quietness is almost shocking. The country he helped shape changes in ways he anticipated and ways he could never have imagined. Highways knit regions closer. Television brings the debates he once could only hear in person into every living room. The welfare state expands, contracts, and expands again. The West grumbles about Ottawa. Quebec asserts itself. The balance between federal and provincial power shifts and shudders. Through it all, the party he once dragged toward the center-right of Canadian politics fights its own internal war over what progressive means. Sometimes, watching from the sidelines, he must feel an eerie déjà vu. Old arguments replayed by new actors, the same tension between business conservatives and social moderates, between central Canada and the rest. By the 1960s, he is an old man in a country that barely remembers the world before wartime factories and television signals. University students debate the future of Canada without recognizing the name of the agronomist-turned-premier who kept one of its provinces solvent through the Depression. Younger politicians rise to office with no personal memory of his tenure. The rivalry that consumed his middle years between him and King, him and Drew, him and the internal skeptics of his own party is now mostly a matter of footnotes and fading press clippings. Time, his last opponent, seems to be winning, and then, almost subtly, another twist. The very qualities that made him seem unexciting to his contemporaries begin to look, in retrospect, like virtues. As political scandals multiply in other eras, as budgets balloon and crash, as parties swing wildly between extremes, a few historians and policy analysts look back and notice something unusual about the long Bracken record. Stability without paralysis, thrift without cruelty, reform without intoxication. They see a premier who steered Manitoba through catastrophe without defaulting, and a federal leader who, even in defeat, pulled his party out of the 19th century and pushed it toward the social concerns of the 20th. In lecture halls, his name surfaces in courses about Canadian federalism, agrarian politics, and the evolution of the party system. In these settings, the rivalry with Mackenzie King takes on a new cast. King is still the magician, the master of survival, the prime minister who presided over war and reconstruction. But Bracken appears beside him now as a kind of quiet counterpoint. Not the man who held power longest, but the one who insisted that power be used to knit unlike interests together instead of merely juggling them. March 18, 1969. The date lands like a single dot at the end of a long, meticulously written sentence. John Bracken dies in Ottawa, far from the experimental plots of his youth and the legislative chambers where he learned to read the weather of politics as carefully as he once read clouds. Newspapers mark his passing with respectful but restrained obituaries. They note his years as premier, his federal leadership, his role in renaming the party. They mention that he was 85. They do not stop the country. They do not prompt days of mourning. But look closer, and you see the invisible lines that run out from that quiet moment. In Manitoba, roads still follow routes first prioritized under his government. Institutions he helped fund, reforms he supervised, patterns of cooperation he cultivated between rural and urban communities, these continue to shape lives he never met. At the federal level, the Progressive Conservative Party that will, in later years, govern under figures very different from him still, carries, until its eventual transformation, the hybrid identity he insisted upon, progressive and conservative, an unresolved tension that mirrors the country itself. If you stand back far enough, John Bracken's life looks almost like an experiment in a laboratory. What happens if you give power over and over to a man who distrusts drama and trusts structures, who believes that rivalry can be harnessed rather than inflamed, who measures success not by applause but by whether the machinery he leaves behind still works when he's gone? The answer is not simple. His name does not blaze like those of some contemporaries, but the Canada that grew in his era, the Canada that discovered you could marry social responsibility to fiscal discipline, that learned to hear Western voices inside national parties, that began to see non-partisan cooperation not as betrayal but as strategy, bears his fingerprints in places most people never think to look. The last deadline he set for himself was primitive and universal: do enough before the clock runs out, that the work outlives the worker. In that race, quietly against time and forgetfulness, John Bracken did something many louder politicians never manage. He lost his final election, he surrendered his titles, he stepped out of the spotlight. And yet, long after the speeches faded and the campaign posters rotted away, the country kept moving along lines he helped to draw, straight, austere, often invisible, like the rows in a well-planted field seen from far above.